convert to
Yeah,
this?
again, I think it's the same story that people don't want to talk too much about it. But when I
Mm,
look at the Springbok rugby team, I definitely think that they've changed. They're much more muscular than they were.
mm,
They don't have that padding of fat
yeah.
that they tend to have high carb athletes. Whereas if I watch tennis, and particularly women's tennis, you'll see they've all got this padding. So although they're very strong women, they're on high carb diets, you can see, and I can't see that that's would be of any advantage to them.
Yeah.
So before the 2019 Rugby World Cup, there was a picture of the South African team just in their shorts, and someone said that's the team that's going to win
Mm.
because they look fantastic, and I can't think that they look like that on high carbohydrate diets, but they keep quiet about it, and so it's the same in the Tour de France.
Yeah.
The Tour de France, they eat enormous amounts of carbohydrate because it's the cult.
Mm.
And if there are cyclists who are eating high fat diets, they're not going to say it because it would be against the cult and they would be excommunicated. In
Mm.
fact, the South African who I helped, and has turned professional recently
Mm.
on a high fat diet, he said, I can't talk about the high fat diet because they said, you will eat a high carbohydrate diet if you're on this team.
There was for a while there was a number of the All Blacks rugby players that were going low
Mm.
carb,
Yeah.
keto, and then but then Wheat Bix was their major sponsor, and they're like, that's enough. You can't talk about this low carb stuff anymore. So like, oh, all right. But I've actually had a few of the people that I think it was around 2015 or so that they started making that switch.
Yeah.
And I actually had one of those players. I won't say his name because I haven't asked him, but he has been an All Black for a number of
Yeah.
years, probably a decade or so, and he has been low carb, really zero carb, and basically carnivore, full carnivore. Like on the off season, he only eats meat, and then he might
Mm.
add in a little bit of stuff during the season. But for the last 8 years, he's been doing that, but just doesn't talk about it. You just have to sort of keep it under wraps.
Yeah.
I guess it's for sponsorships, but also because if everybody knows the secret, well then it's not really a secret anymore, and you're just on an even playing field.
One of my students from South Africa went to New Zealand, and she was a dietitian who we trained, and we trained on the high carbs, And so she goes to Auckland, and one day in about 2014, 2015, maybe a bit earlier than that, Grant says to her, I'm hearing about this high fat story. What do you think? I'm sure it's wrong, but what do you think? So she went away for a month and researched, and she came back. She said, Grant, we've been wrong all this time. We have to change.
Mm.
And the Auckland University of Technology is one of the centers for studying low carb diets in the world. It's done brilliant work. And
Nice.
that was because Grant, the professor, who was also an elite ultra distance athlete, he also decided to change and found that helped him. And they then incorporated that, and they started working with the Auckland All Blacks. And I think that's where it sort of started. Yeah, so there's a paper published in the Journal of Applied Physiology about 3 or 4 months ago. And if I have difficulty pronouncing the guy's name, I think it's Lukaszewicz, something like that. And he did a really good model, but models are not science. They are a projection. They're not an experiment. You base it on all your assumptions. So I took the article and I said, really, it's really interesting. Let's see if there are any flaws in it. Because he concluded that you couldn't run a sub-2 hour marathon unless you're eating carbohydrates at 90 to 120 grams per hour.
Mm.
That's the finding. You cannot run a sub-2 hour marathon unless you take in 90 to 120 grams of carbohydrate every hour for 2 hours. So I went through very carefully his model. So his model was valid. It's valid. But he made 2 assumptions that destroy the model. Otherwise, in other words, on the models the assumptions he made, fine. But there were 2 assumptions that unfortunately undermine the study. The first one is that you don't burn any fat when you're running a 2 hour marathon because you're running at 90% VO2 max. And that's contentious because we've shown you can burn a lot of fat when you're exercising vigorously. But he could still say, no, but I'm right. Athletes can't burn when they're exercising that vigorously. Fine. Okay. That's your point. Go and study it. But until you've studied it, we'll accept that. But the one major error was that when you take in carbohydrates 120 grams per hour, he assumed that 120 grams was being burnt every hour from point one. And that doesn't happen, because when you take carbs, they take time. It takes about 60 minutes to 90 minutes before you reach these high rates of oxidation. And so you've got this lag phase. And during that lag phase, the athletes couldn't burn the amount of carbohydrate he said they needed to run that race. So therefore, his model proves that you can't run a sub-2 hour marathon on carbohydrates alone. So then when you retweak the model, it turns out that if they burn a little bit of fat, and like 7.7 grams a minute, which is not much, you're fine. You can take a little bit of carbs during the race and you'll be fine. So in trying to prove that carbohydrates are absolutely essential for a sub-2 hour marathon, he disproved it, which is fantastic. He proved you can't do it on carbs. Therefore, you have to do it adapted to a higher fat diet.